You're listening to The End of the Road in Michigan, the podcast uncovering the forgotten, unusual, and fascinating stories that shaped our state. Newberry, Michigan is the county seat of Luce County in the eastern Upper Peninsula, and it grew up on two sounds, the whistle of a train and the steady work of the woods. Here's the question that hangs over the place. How did a small rail town built for cutting trees end up selling summer vacations and keep its footing when the timber started to thin? In the early 1900s, Newberry functioned like an outpost with a payroll. Rail lines made it possible. Without the tracks, it would have been another clearing in the forest. With the tracks, it became a hub for men, equipment, and products moving across the UP. Logging set the calendar. Winter meant cutting. Frozen ground made hauling possible. Spring brought mud and breakup when roads turned soft and schedules slipped. Summer meant repairs, shipments, and the next plan. The work was loud, it was physical, it was also uncertain. A mill could slow down with one bad market. A camp could close after a hard season. Newberry's economy did not rely on lumber alone. That's one of the details that makes the town different from a lot of northern communities. It also relied on a charcoal-based iron and chemical operation that used hardwood to make charcoal, feeding an industrial process that produced pig iron and other products. The point isn't romance, the point is labor. A system like that required steady inputs, steady crews, steady shipments. It left smoke in the air and soot on clothing. It made Newberry an industrial town, not just a logging town. Then there was the courthouse, because Newberry was also a county seat. That meant deeds and probate and trials and the steady work of government. In a place where private industry could rise and fall fast, public functions gave the town another kind of stability. And just outside the center of town stood an institution that shaped Newberry for generations, the state hospital. The facility opened in the late 1890s and expanded through the early 20th century. It employed large numbers of people for a community this size. It also drew patients from across the Upper Peninsula. For local families, the hospital could mean a dependable job and a regular paycheck. For the region, it reflected the era's approach to mental illness, long-term institutional care, strict routines, and a system that could range from dedicated treatment to overcrowding and neglect, depending on leadership and funding. That's a hard truth to sit with, but it belongs in the story. Because towns like Newberry did not only grow from industry, they grew in institutions too. Newberry was also shaped by who came to work. Immigrants from Finland, Sweden, and other parts of Northern Europe became part of the workforce in the camps, mills, and rail operations. They formed churches and social circles. In small towns, these groups could live close while staying separate. Over time, they also intermarried, shared workplaces, and built the civic life that made a transient boomtown feel permanent. By the 1910s and 1920s, the timber era changed. Parts of the original forest had been cut hard. Some operations moved, others scaled down or shifted. That pattern played out across the Upper Peninsula. Rapid growth, then a slower period when a town has to decide whether it will shrink or adapt. Newberry adapted. One reason was the road. Cars brought a new kind of visitor, families with time, curiosity, and a willingness to drive farther than earlier generations would have attempted. The Upper Peninsula began to feel reachable. Not easy, but reachable. That shift set up a second economy. Tourism. The area around the Tahquamenon Falls and River had long been part of Ojibwe life, travel routes, and place names. That history didn't begin with postcards or vacationers. It ran deeper than the town itself. When more visitors began arriving in the early 20th century, they often experienced the same places as a trip, a temporary escape. For local and indigenous communities, it was not an escape. It was part of a lived region. Newberry became a practical base for that growing traffic. It had lodging, it had stores, it had food, It had the services that turned a difficult trip into a manageable one. And it had a local instinct that can be summed up this way: if people are coming, we might as well be ready. Cabins and tourist camps made it easier for travelers to stay. Hotels served both locals and visitors. You could feel the mix on a summer evening: working people finishing a shift, tourists looking for supper, clerks and shop owners watching the season's business. In the 1930s, the Depression pressed down on everything. Jobs were tighter, wages were squeezed. Yet Newberry had the hospital payroll, county functions, and what remained of its industrial base. It did not make the decade comfortable. It helped the town hold. And then came a flashpoint in 1937 when a lumberman's labor conflict turned into a confrontation that the town remembered for years. Local accounts describe outside organizers arriving to push a strike and locals forming a volunteer force to drive them out. The details vary depending on the source and the teller, but the broader meaning is clear. Newberry feared instability more than it trusted outside solutions. In a place where winter could be unforgiving and work could disappear, many residents treated any threat to payroll as a threat to the whole town. At the same time, the idea of protecting Tahquamenon Falls as public land gained momentum during the 1930s. That effort took organizing and land acquisition, and it reflected a broader change. Parts of the UP were beginning to see long-term value in preservation and recreation, not only extraction. By the time the 1940s arrived, Newberry had become two things at once. It was still a work town: rail, timber, public jobs, the hospital. It was also a gateway: cabins, camps, hotels, and the steady pull of Tahquamenon. That combination is why the town endured. Newberry didn't need to pretend it was a resort, and it didn't cling to the idea that the old timber boom would return in full force. It built a life in the middle ground, a town that kept a practical grip on reality while making room for visitors who wanted a weekend in the north. Thank you for listening to this episode of The End of the Road in Michigan. To find out more about the history of Newberry, look for this story and sources on thumbwind.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider subscribing and leaving a review. It helps others find the show. Until next time, we will look for you on our upcoming adventure at the end of the road in Michigan.